I'm Jason Bulmahn, Director of Game Design at Paizo and creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. Today, I wanted to talk with all of you a little bit about some of the foundations of game design. I need to kind of lay down some groundwork if I'm going to delve into deeper topics. So first off, I want to talk about simplicity and complexity in games and why those two things aren't necessarily at odds with one another, and in fact, why your game probably needs a bit of both. To get started, I think we should probably talk about simplicity and what I mean. I think everybody gets what complexity is. I'll delve deeper into that later. But first, I want to talk about what I mean by simplicity. When players approach a game, there's something called the barrier to entry. And what that is all of the steps they need to take from the moment they open up the product, the book, the box, to the moment that they start playing, to the point where they start having fun. This is a really important critical time because if the barrier is too big, if it's too daunting, if it's too great, they might put that game down and never touch it again. So in game design, we like to find ways to make that barrier, that initial hurdle, as small as possible. We kind of want the game, no matter how complex, how big, how robust it is, to be as simple as possible in that first expression. So there's a lot of different ways that barrier can represent itself. And when you're designing a game, you have to approach each one of those barriers differently and try and find some ways to mitigate them, especially to get people involved. So there's obviously the rules barrier. How many rules do people need to know before they're able to start playing? There's the setup barrier. How long does it take to set up? How many pieces do you have to put down? How much shuffling do you have to do? How many pawns you have to put out? Just kind of getting the game ready to play can be a barrier. There's also a barrier in number of players. If a game requires 4 players, that's a barrier. If somebody doesn't have, 3 friends lying around, they have to wait until they can find the right number to start playing. And lastly, there's a barrier of preparation. This is a little less common in many games, but when you think of a game like, say, tabletop miniatures war games, there's a certain amount of things you need to do before you can even start. You at least have to cut out minis from sprues and glue them together. In some of the more hardcore cases, you might even want to paint them as well. That can be an entire another hobby or activity in and of itself. But it does count as a barrier. It's a thing you have to do before you can start playing. It could be fun. A lot of those things can be fun. Rule books can be fun to read. Setup can be engaging. Talking with players about the upcoming game can certainly be an exciting activity, but they're still in the way from what, as a designer, is the core of your experience. So how do you sidestep these? How do you take those barriers and make them simple? How do you make the on-ramp to your game as simple as possible? A lot of games will do this with quick start rules. They'll take their rule set, they'll trim them down, and they'll make it so that it's real easy to adapt. It's real easy to pick up. You can just kind of skip most of the complexity and get right to the game. In terms of setup, they might give you an initial setup. They might say, hey, only use these parts. In some board games, some of the more clever ones I've seen, they'll actually segregate the components and say, only use the ones from this tray or this packet first. Use those first. Don't worry about the rest later. I'm not even going to bury you in components first. I'm just going to say, play with these pieces first. Others might have a solo option. If they need multiple players, they might have a small solo game invested in the box that you can just play right out of the box by yourself. And finally, when it comes to preparation, overcoming that might involve something like pawns or some pre-constructed miniatures or some ways that you can at least get a sample of the game using like tokens or something so that you can literally open up the box and start playing within minutes. So complexity here in this early part is kind of your enemy. You don't want to engage with it too deeply, but you want to leave the door open to complexity for a deeper experience. So you want that intro, that first thing, to be kind of the trail. You want to leave the breadcrumbs to the complexity that you're actually trying to create. You want to set out kind of the path that leads to the full game. So you don't want to hide it. You don't want to obfuscate it entirely. You want to blend it into your intro, your start, that simple beginning of the game. But you ultimately kind of want to sidestep it as much as possible. Now, what types of complexity are there? Because I've talked about barriers to entry, but those aren't necessarily complexity. Those are things that get in the way of simplicity. Complexity is one of those things. But there's different types of complexity, and your intro should speak to those types. So there's mechanical complexity. There's just the rules of the game are complicated. There's a lot to learn, there's a lot to adapt, there's a lot to absorb. Pathfinder certainly falls into this category. A lot of role-playing games do, in fact. You know, if I think really deep down the spectrum, I get to something like Rollmaster or, you know, some of the earlier games where the rules kind of were just built on top of each other and you just had to learn and memorize them. There was no rhyme or reason to them. Excuse me. There was also, there's strategic complexity. And that means that the game itself could be relatively simple, but there's very deep strategy. You have to learn a lot about the game and learn how to master it. Think of chess or Go, or even Magic the Gathering. Has deep strategic complexity. The place that you have to learn there is how to win. The rules are relatively simple. There's preparation complexity, going back to one of the barriers to entry. Preparation complexity is certainly a challenge. And this isn't just painting minis and getting things ready. It's also planning and writing the next script, right? You know, if you're running a role-playing game and you have to plan out the next session, that counts as complexity. That's an element of your game that is robust and challenging for people to do without practice and experience. That's a part of complexity. There's also something called choice complexity. And what this is that the game offers a broad selection of choice. There's a lot of options in the game. A lot of games will feature this in addition to other types of complexity. Pathfinder certainly has a lot of choice complexity. Magic has a lot of choice complexity. Chess doesn't. There's a lot of choices you can make, but they're pretty much right in front of you, and there's only a handful that are going to be viable. Whereas in something like Magic, when you're trying to put together a deck out of thousands of cards, well, you have a lot to choose from. So it's important for you to understand what type of complexity is right for your game, you know, and this comes down to understanding your audience. I could probably do an entire video just on understanding your audience, figuring out who are you making this game for, and then tailoring it to their wants, desires, and the experience that you want them to have. But for now, let's just say that you know what your audience is, and then you have to find a way to tailor your complexity to their needs. In this way, the complexity is something, it's not your enemy, it's something to be managed, something to be leveraged to make your chosen audience interested in your game. So let's take Pathfinder 1st Edition and Pathfinder 2nd Edition as an example. I think in Pathfinder 1st Edition, we had a lot of mechanical complexity, not a lot of strategic complexity, but a fair amount. There was certainly a lot of choice complexity, especially in the later years of the game, right? You get 10 years of books and you got a lot of choices. 2nd edition obviously is going to have less of that choice complexity, at least at first. I know that a lot of people are looking at the playtest going, boy, it doesn't seem like I have the same amount of options as in 1st edition. Well, I mean, that's not really a surprise. There's one book as opposed to 30. But we are trying to get a little bit lighter on the mechanical complexity, to be honest. Our barrier to entry in the previous game was rather rough, right? If you looked at the core rulebook, it was not a great teaching tool. It was based off the 3.5 SRD. It had kind of some of the same problems that that system had and didn't really work to smooth any of that over until the beginner box. The beginner box was, for us, a big learning experience. It was a way that we came to understand some of the barriers that stood in the way of our game. So with 2nd edition, we're kind of taking a slightly different approach. We want the barrier to be low. We want the base engine of the game to be relatively simple to understand, something that you can kind of dive into and learn all of the corners pretty quickly. We then want the choice complexity and the mechanical complexity to ramp up over time. We don't want it in the base. Pathfinder First Edition had a lot of it right in the base. For Second Edition, we're trying this a little differently. We're trying to put more of it into the back end through the choices that you make. So if you decide to build a fighter with opens and presses, your turn is going to become a lot more strategic. Whereas you could build without those, and then your turn is less that. It's the complexity that you want to play with. For us, that's kind of a big departure. And the great part is you're the only one who has to know that. The guy next to you doesn't need to learn all about every different combat maneuver because he may not have the capability to do them or the interest. So looping all the way back around to the start, the entry should lay the foundation to the complexity that you want, to give the player a sense of what the full game was like. So I've talked about all those barriers. I've talked about what you want to kind of do to overcome them. I've talked about the types of complexity. Now, when you want to marry those two together, what you want is the entry to the game to basically lay the breadcrumbs for the heart of the game experience. So you don't want to hide this. Like, there is a temptation to be like, oh, this part of the game is really complex, so we'll just cut it out of the base. We won't include it at all. But you're kind of doing your player a disservice. If that's the game you want, if that's the game you're trying to make, you don't want to hide all of its nooks and crannies. You want to give a sense of them without delving into them. Because you want the players to understand this is the type of game they're getting into. You don't want them to have an experience, then get into the full game and kind of bait and switch them, right? You don't want them to be like, oh, this isn't the game I thought it was at all. All of a sudden it's about economic management and farm systems and all kinds of crazy stuff. And you know, they thought it was a fun little light adventure game. But as it turns out, it's an economic simulator, right? And you were like, oh, that's too complex, so we'll just cut that out from the base. You don't want to do that. So you want to kind of just give them some breadcrumbs of it. So if you're going for mechanical complexity, you might want to give them some elements that are mechanically complex, but give them to them in a way where it's like, okay, now we're going to try this concept out in the middle of the adventure. So, for example, in the beginner box, we start out with just a simple combat. Now, we could have just kept it to combat, and you might have walked away from the game thinking, wow, this is a combat game. It's a little combat board game. But we wanted more than that. So later on, there's a skill challenge. There's ways that you can use your skills. There's ways you can use diplomacy. There's ways you can find traps. There's treasure. There's all sorts of things. And we just kind of laid pieces of them. But instead of giving them to you all at once, we just introduce them one at a time in encapsulated encounters to give you a sense of what the full game might be. If you're going for strategic complexity, you probably want to give them kind of branching choice points where you go, okay, well, this is the base thing you can do, and now you can do one of two things. And then from one of those, you can do one of two things. You want to kind of give them a sense of it without drowning them in all of the choices all at once. All of those options can get in the way. For preparation complexity, you definitely want to give them a sense. So if you were giving them all tokens, you might say, all right, but assemble your commander, right? Let's put him together first. I just want you to do one, right? Or if we're doing a board that needs to be set up, and there's going to be a whole lot of pieces later on, a whole bunch of tiles you need to put down to build a map, and then minis you need to put down and stuff like that. You might start with a simple expression that's just like, put down these 2 rooms, put out these 4 minis, just to give them a sense of what it is that they're going to be doing in the game. All of this serves to, through a simple on-ramp, get them to the point where they are immersed and invested in your game. That is how you build an audience. That's how you build interest in your game. That's how you get the right fans that you were actually targeting to get, right? You know, when you're building a game, you're trying to not only anticipate who your audience is, you're trying to make sure that that audience gets a sense of it and gets involved. Because a bigger player base, more people playing the game, means more fun for everybody, especially when it comes to role-playing games. You need a lot of people to make those things happen. So that kind of wraps up the initial discussion anyway on simplicity versus complexity. I'm going to keep doing more videos like this, I think. We're going to continue to lay down some foundations and kind of build a design lexicon for those of you who are interested. Tune in. I'm hoping to do these about twice a week. So if you're interested in seeing more, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Thanks a lot.